The first night the rain had been falling since late afternoon, heavy enough to turn the gardens of the Ward estate into a silver curtain beyond the tall windows. Naomi Brooks stood in the East Wing hallway with a stack of freshly laundered towels. Balanced in her arms, the faint scent of lavender soap clinging to the fabric. It was her second week working here, and she was still learning the unspoken rules that filled this place. There were many: where to walk, how to address the staff above her, which rooms were forbidden without an invitation. But the most important rule had been repeated on her first day in the clipped, matter-of-fact tone of Mrs. Green, the head housekeeper. "You are here to clean, Miss Brooks. You are not here to care for the child. Mr. Ward has a nanny for that. Keep your distance." Naomi had nodded at the time, saying nothing, though she had wondered why a baby needed such guarded protection from the people who kept the house running. Now she thought she understood. Elias Ward, billionaire founder of a technology empire, was not a man who let anyone get too close. The house reflected him, immaculate, expensive, and cold. She was nearly to the laundry room when a sound reached her from the nursery upstairs, a thin, piercing cry that cut straight through the steady rhythm of the rain. Naomi froze. She had heard the baby before, of course. Her name was Amara, barely a year old, with a mess of black curls and a laugh the staff whispered about because it was so rare. But this sound was different, urgent, hoarse, a cry that didn't stop after the first minute or fade into a whimper. Naomi glanced toward the grand staircase, debating with herself. It wasn't her place. Mrs. Green's warning rang in her mind. And yet, she had lived enough years in foster homes to know the difference between a baby fussing for attention and a baby in distress. Before she could talk herself out of it, Naomi set the towels on a side table and climbed the stairs 2 at a time. The nursery was dim when she pushed the door open, lit only by a small lamp in the corner. Amara was standing in her crib, fists clinging to the railing, her face red and wet with tears. There was no nanny in sight, no soft voice to soothe her. Naomi's heart tightened at the sight. She stepped closer, speaking low. "Hey, now, what's all this, little one?" Amara's cries hitched but didn't stop. Naomi reached down without thinking, scooping the child into her arms. The warmth of that small body against her chest was immediate, almost shocking, as if she'd been cold without realizing it until now. Amara buried her face into Naomi's neck, sobbing into the fabric of her uniform. Naomi began to rock gently, murmuring nonsense words the way her grandmother had once done when she was small. Slowly the trembling eased. The cries softened into hiccups, then into deep, even breaths. Naomi felt the child's weight grow heavier as sleep began to take her. She didn't mean to sit down on the nursery floor, but her knees bent on instinct. Lowering herself onto the soft rug with Amara still clinging to her. Outside, the rain tapped against the glass in a slow, soothing rhythm. Naomi leaned back against the wall, keeping the baby close, breathing in the faint scent of milk and baby powder. For the first time in a long while, she felt herself let go of the tension she carried in her shoulders. The world shrank to this warm circle, her arms, the child's breath, the steady beat of a heart so small she could feel it through the thin cotton of her uniform. She told herself she'd put Amara back in the crib in just a moment, but that moment stretched and the soft darkness folded around her. She didn't notice when her own eyes closed. The sound of the nursery door snapping open pulled her back like a jolt of electricity. Naomi blinked, disoriented, and looked up into the shadowed frame of a tall man. Elias Ward's presence filled the doorway even before he spoke. Sharp black suit, rain still clinging to the shoulders of his coat, his gaze cold enough to make the air in the room drop a few degrees. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice was low but edged, the kind that could slice without raising in volume. Naomi shifted, her arms instinctively tightening around Amara. "She was crying," Naomi said, keeping her voice even. "No one was here. You are not her mother," he cut in, stepping inside, his polished shoes silent on the rug. "You don't touch her. You don't hold her. That's not what I pay you for." He extended his arms toward the child, and for a brief second Naomi thought she might hand Amara over just to end the moment. But the baby stirred, sensing the shift, and began to whimper again. Her small hands clutching at the front of Naomi's uniform, Elias's jaw tightened. "Give her to me." Naomi looked at him then, really looked, and saw the fatigue buried under the steel of his expression, the uncertainty he was trying so hard to mask. "She's scared," Naomi said quietly. "If you take her now?" She screamed again. "She's exhausted." "That's not your decision to make," he said, but there was the faintest hesitation in his stance. Amara made a soft, miserable sound and burrowed deeper against Naomi's chest. Naomi felt the weight of his gaze, the calculation behind his eyes. Then slowly he lowered his arms. The defeat in the gesture was so slight that another person might have missed it, but Naomi caught it. Without another word, Elias stepped back. She continued to rock the baby, humming under her breath until Amara's breathing settled once more. The silence in the room grew heavy, filled only by the sound of rain and the quiet rhythm of the child's breath. When Naomi finally rose, she laid Amara gently in the crib, tucking the blanket around her with careful hands. She turned toward the door, expecting Elias to have left, but he was still there watching. His eyes were unreadable, but he stepped aside without speaking as she passed. Naomi didn't look back. She knew better than to mistake his silence for approval. Still, as she walked back down the hall to retrieve the forgotten towels, her hands no longer trembled. In that small, unexpected moment, she had chosen the child over the rules, and she would again if it came to it dot walls and windows. The next morning broke with a pale light that filtered through the estate's towering windows, painting the marble floors in soft gold. Naomi moved quietly through the west wing, the steady swish of her mop the only sound in the echoing corridor. The memory of the night before clung to her like the faint scent of rain still lingering in the air, the warmth of Amara in her arms, the sharpness in Elias Ward's voice, the way his hands had lowered when he saw the baby refuse to leave her. She had expected to wake to a reprimand, perhaps even a call from Mrs. Green telling her she no longer had a position here. Instead, there had been nothing, no mention of it at breakfast. No glances from the staff, no folded note with her week's pay and a request to pack her things. It was as though the night had slipped into the house's unspoken vault of secrets, sealed behind its immaculate walls, but Naomi knew better than to think it was forgotten. In houses like this, silence was never emptiness. It was pressure, like the air before a storm. She kept her head down, moving from room to room, dusting and polishing, keeping herself invisible, or trying to. More than once she caught sight of a figure in the periphery, standing in the shadowed doorway of his office or paused on the mezzanine balcony. Elias. He didn't speak, didn't linger long enough to be confronted, but she knew he was watching. It was the kind of observation that didn't come from suspicion alone. It felt almost like study. She wondered if he was trying to make sense of why his daughter had calmed for her and not for him. Or perhaps he was simply waiting for her to step out of line again. That afternoon, Naomi was in the kitchen rinsing a set of silver platters when Mrs. Green swept in, her expression as crisp as the starch in her blouse. "Mr. Ward will be working from home today," she announced without looking directly at Naomi. The child's nanny had to take personal leave. Naomi kept her eyes on the stream of water hitting the steel sink, but her hands stilled. "Who will be with Amara?" she asked carefully. Mrs. Green's tone didn't soften. "Mr. Ward, of course." The implication was clear. Naomi's services would not be required in the nursery. But later, as she passed the hallway that led, there she heard it again, that same thin, distressed wail, the sound threading through the quiet like a signal flare. She didn't move toward it at first. Her hands tightened on the laundry basket she carried, and she forced herself forward down the main hall. But halfway to the service stairs, the crying shifted, growing sharper, more panicked. It reached something in her she could not turn away from. She set the basket down, the folded towels falling in a neat heap, and made her way back. When she reached the nursery doorway, she found Elias inside, holding Amara awkwardly against his chest. His movements were hesitant, almost mechanical, as though he were following instructions written on an invisible page. "She," he was murmuring. but his voice lacked the softness that could bridge the space between a child's fear and comfort. Amara's face was buried in his suit jacket, her sobs shaking her small body. Naomi hovered on the threshold, unsure if she should enter. But then Amara lifted her head, saw her, and reached out with both arms, her cries turning into urgent whimpers. Elias's eyes flicked up to meet Naomi's, and in them she saw frustration, but also a flicker of something else, resignation. Without a word, he stepped toward her and handed the child over. The instant Amara settled against Naomi, the cries began to fade, replaced by little hiccups and the occasional shuddering breath. Naomi swayed gently, her palm pressed to the back of the baby's head. "There you go, sweetheart," she murmured. "You're all right now." Elias stood a few feet away, his hands dropping to his sides. His gaze locked on them as though trying to decode an equation that refused to solve. "She knows you," he said finally, his voice low. Naomi glanced at him. "She knows I won't put her down until she feels safe." His jaw shifted as though he were about to argue, but the words didn't come. Instead, he turned toward the window, staring out at the rain-streaked glass. "I don't understand it," he admitted, almost to himself. "I've done everything they said, read the books, kept the routines, given her the best care money can buy." Naomi's arms tightened slightly around the child. "Maybe she needs something money can't buy." The words hung in the air, between them unchallenged. Amara had fallen asleep again, her tiny fingers curled into the collar of Naomi's uniform. Naomi adjusted her grip and stepped past him toward the crib. As she laid the baby down, she felt his presence close behind, not intruding, but watching with an attention that felt different now, less guarded, more curious. Later that night, Naomi was making her way back to her small room at the far end of the servants' wing when she passed the study. The door was open just enough for her to see Elias at his desk, the glow from his laptop casting shadows across his face. His eyes weren't on the screen, though. They were fixed on the small baby monitor to his left, where a grainy black-and-white image showed Amara sleeping soundly. Naomi lingered only a second before continuing on, but the image stayed with her. For all his money, his power, his control, Elias Ward was still a man pacing at the edge of a wall he didn't know how to climb. What Naomi didn't realize was that from that night on, the wall between them had begun to thin, not from grand gestures or deliberate breaking down, but from moments like these, small as a breath, that seeped through the cracks. And in a house built on rules and distance, that was the first real change of all. The confession the following week brought a peculiar shift in the rhythm of the house. Naomi noticed it first in the small things, the way Elias no longer avoided her entirely in the hallways, the way his gaze sometimes lingered when she was with Amara, as if he was storing away details for later. The other staff noticed too. Though no one said anything outright, Mrs. Green still spoke to her in the same crisp, managerial tone. But Naomi caught the older woman glancing between her and Mr. Ward more than once, as though taking quiet inventory of a change she couldn't quite name. Even the air in the estate felt different, warmer somehow, though the early spring winds outside still carried the bite of winter. It was a Tuesday morning when the call came, a short, business-like conversation that Mrs. Green took in the kitchen before coming to find Naomi. "Social services will be doing a routine visit this afternoon," she said, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp. "They'll want to see the child's living arrangements, her routines, and speak with Mr. Ward. Sometimes they speak with the staff as well. Be prepared." Naomi set down the vase she'd been dusting. "Why social services?" "She's not—" She trailed off, not wanting to finish the thought. Mrs. Green sighed. "It's standard. When the primary caregiver, in this case the mother, is absent for a prolonged period, they follow up. Paperwork, check-ins, making sure the household is stable." Stable. Naomi thought about that word for a long moment. She thought about the late nights she'd heard Amara crying through the walls, about Elias's awkward attempts at soothing her, about the way the baby clung to her every time they were together. She wasn't sure how stability was measured on a form, but she knew a child could feel it, or the lack of it, in their bones. By the time the social worker arrived, the house was polished to a mirror shine. The woman introduced herself. As Carmen, dressed neatly in a navy suit, her smile warm but assessing. She had the kind of presence Naomi recognized from her own childhood, gentle enough to coax trust, but sharp enough to catch every unspoken truth. Naomi answered her questions. In the nursery, careful to speak plainly but honestly. She's thriving, Naomi said, glancing toward Amara, who was stacking colorful blocks on the rug. She has a routine, she eats well, she's curious. Carmen nodded, jotting down notes, but her next question was less formal. And she's bonded to you? Naomi hesitated, glancing toward the door where Elias stood listening. She knows I'm here, Naomi replied finally. Carmen's gaze flicked toward Mr. Ward, who shifted slightly under the weight of it. Consistency matters, Carmen said simply. Before closing her notebook after the visit, the house felt unusually quiet, as if holding its breath. Elias found her that evening in the nursery, standing by the window while Amara dozed in her crib. You were good with her, he said from the doorway. Naomi didn't turn. I wasn't performing for her. That's just how I am with Amara. He stepped inside, his voice quieter now. I noticed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the monitor and the soft rustle of the baby's breathing. Then Elias's voice shifted, losing its usual command. I haven't told anyone this. Not the staff, not even my brother. Naomi turned then, curiosity narrowing her eyes. Told them what? He moved closer to the crib, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the sleeping child. I don't know how to be her father. I keep thinking if I just follow the schedules, if I keep her safe and healthy, I'll figure it out. But she looks at me sometimes like I'm a stranger. Naomi studied him, sensing that he wasn't done, and he wasn't. Her mother, Sophia. She died in an accident. The car skidded off the road during a storm. I wasn't there. I was in a boardroom in Singapore arguing over a merger. By the time I got the call, it was already over. Amara was 6 months old. I told myself she wouldn't remember, but now I wonder if she feels the absence every day. His voice caught on that last word, just barely, but Naomi heard it. She let the silence hold for a moment before speaking. When I was 6, my mother left me at a neighbor's for the weekend and never came back. Foster homes aren't built for comfort. You learn fast not to get attached because people don't stay. But sometimes there's one person, a foster parent, a teacher, someone who looks at you like you matter. You cling to that even if it's only for a little while. For Amara, that needs to be you. Elias looked at her then, his expression stripped of the guardedness he usually wore. I don't know if I can undo what's already missing. Naomi's gaze softened. You don't have to undo it. You just have to show up now, every day, in ways she can feel, not just see. Something unspoken passed between them in that moment, not agreement, not forgiveness, but recognition. They were two people shaped by absence, standing in the dim light of a nursery, trying to figure out what it meant to stay. And though neither said it out loud, both of them knew that the walls they had built around themselves had just shifted a little closer to windows. Learning to stay the days following Ilias's confession unfolded with a kind of tentative grace, like the first fragile thaw after winter. Naomi found herself included in small decisions that had once been made without her. What Amara would have for breakfast, which books should line the low shelf in the nursery, whether the child's afternoon nap would be taken inside or on the shaded veranda when the weather turned mild. These were not grand invitations, but subtle shifts in the current, and Naomi, though wary, allowed herself to drift with them. For the first time, she wasn't simply reacting to the demands of the household. She was shaping them, however quietly. Elias's presence was different too. He no longer lingered in doorways pretending to be passing by. He would step into the nursery without the armor of a business call in his ear, kneel on the floor beside Amara, and let her pull him into a lopsided game of stacking blocks or chasing after the soft cloth ball Naomi had sewn for her. He still carried the air of a man accustomed to being obeyed, but the sharp edges of his commands had begun to dull in the soft space between father and daughter. Naomi saw it most clearly one afternoon when Amara, in the midst of learning to take unsteady steps, stumbled toward Elias, arms wide. Instead of catching her like one might a fragile package, he crouched low, swept her into the curve of his body, and laughed, a sound Naomi had never heard from him before. Rich and unguarded. It was later that same day, after Amara had been settled for her nap, that Elias asked Naomi to join him in the study. The request alone was unusual. Most staff avoided that room unless summoned for something specific. She found him at his desk, not behind the glow of his laptop, but leaning back with a legal pad and pen in hand. Spread out before him were sketches, notes, and half-formed diagrams. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began without preamble, "about showing up in ways she can feel." He tapped the pad. "My company's been developing a new division, a support network for single parents, caregivers, guardians. It's been stagnant. Too much focus on tech, not enough on the people who'd actually use it." Naomi moved closer, scanning the mess of notes. "What do you need from me?" Elias met her gaze. "A perspective I can't buy? You've lived the realities we're trying to address. You've seen the gaps, the missing pieces. I can hire consultants, but they'll give me market data, not truth. I want you to consult. Tell us what matters, what works, what's just a waste of everyone's time." The idea both startled and unsettled her. She wasn't a business strategist. She'd never been inside a boardroom. The closest she'd come to advising anyone was telling Mrs. Green that Amara slept better after an afternoon walk. Yet there was something in Elias's tone, not pity, not flattery, but a kind of deliberate respect, that made her pause, before declining outright. She leaned over the desk, scanning one page in particular where the word "community" was circled 3 times. "If you want to build something real," she said slowly, "you start with trust. And trust doesn't come from a slick interface. It comes from people knowing someone's actually listening on the other side." Elias nodded, jotting something down. "That's exactly why I'm asking." And so, in the quiet hours after the house settled each night, Naomi began jotting her own notes in a small spiral-bound notebook she kept hidden in the drawer of her bedside table. Ideas came from memories, the kind of resources she'd wished for during her years in foster care, the voices she'd longed to hear when she felt invisible, the practical lifelines that would have mattered more than any polished brochure. She brought them to the study in the evenings, and together they began shaping the bones of the project. Elias would read her ideas aloud, sometimes pushing back, sometimes expanding on them, but always with the same underlying premise, that her voice had weight here. In these exchanges, Naomi noticed something changing in herself too. She was no longer moving through the house as though it belonged to someone else entirely. She was, in small ways, leaving her imprint, a blanket folded just so in the nursery, a shelf of children's books that told stories beyond castles and crowns, a conversation that lingered in the study long after the work was done. The walls that had once felt like they existed to keep her out now felt less like barriers and more like the frame of something still under construction. The true measure of this shift came one breezy afternoon when Amara took her first steps, without holding on to anything. She had been wobbling between the low coffee table and the edge of the couch, her little legs trembling with the effort, when she suddenly lurched forward, one step, then another straight toward where Naomi sat on the rug. Elias had been on the opposite side of the room, and for a moment Naomi wondered if the child would veer toward him instead. But Amara didn't even glance in his direction. She went straight into Naomi's waiting arms, collapsing into laughter. That was half triumph, half joy. Elias watched the moment with an expression Naomi couldn't quite read. It wasn't jealousy, but there was a shadow of something that looked like longing. Still, when Naomi looked up, he was smiling, and there was no mistaking the sincerity in it. "She walked to you," he said quietly. Naomi kissed the top of Amara's curls. She walked toward where she felt steady, and in that instant Naomi realized that these quiet, steady moments were the truest measure of what it meant to stay. The first sign of trouble arrived in the form of a glossy black sports car pulling up the winding drive late on a Thursday afternoon. Naomi had been in the garden with Amara, guiding her tiny hands over the petals of early blooming tulips, when the low, throaty growl of the engine rolled across the estate. The car was the kind of thing you didn't park in the city unless you had an entourage to watch it, sleek enough to look out of place against the weathered stone of the house. Naomi straightened slowly, lifting Amara onto her hip just as a tall man stepped out from behind the driver's door. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd been raised to believe the world tilted in his favor. Charcoal sweater, casual slacks, the kind of expensive watch that could buy a year's rent. Michael, Elias's voice called from the open front door, the sound laced with both surprise and a tight thread of reluctance. Naomi realized then that this was his younger brother, the one Mrs. Green had once described as charming until it matters. Michael grinned broadly as he approached, arms open, but there was something in his eyes that scanned the space around him before settling. Like a man checking the room for valuables before offering a handshake. Introductions were made, though. Naomi noticed Elias's tone carried none of the warmth one might expect between siblings. Michael's gaze flicked to her and lingered longer than it should have, his smile taking on a lazy curve. "And who might you be?" he asked. Naomi adjusted Amara in her arms, the child's head turning instinctively toward her shoulder. "Naomi Brooks," she said evenly. "I work here." Michael's brows lifted slightly, his eyes dropping to the baby. "Work here, or run the place." The comment was casual, even teasing, but Naomi recognized the kind of remark meant to slip under someone's skin. She offered him nothing in return, letting the silence answer for her over the next hour. Michael's presence seemed to soak into the house in the way oil spreads over still water, smooth on the surface, but impossible to ignore, he complimented. Mrs. Green's cooking with a tone that suggested he was used to something better, asked pointed questions about Elias's business, and every so often cast Naomi a glance that made her feel like a curiosity rather than a person. Elias noticed. She could see it in the way his jaw tensed each time, but for the most part, he said nothing. The evening deepened into a pale blue dusk, and the household quieted until Amara's sudden, thin cry carried down the hall from the nursery. Naomi excused herself without waiting for approval, moving quickly to the child's side. She found Amara flushed and restless, her skin warmer than usual, her small hands batting weakly at the blanket. A quick touch to her forehead confirmed what Naomi feared: a fever was rising. She soothed the baby with cool water and gentle, rocking, humming low to calm her, but the heat in that tiny body was unsettling. By the time Elias appeared in the doorway, Michael's shadow visible just behind him, Naomi had settled into the rocking chair, Amara tucked against her chest. "She's running hot," Naomi said without preamble. "We should call her pediatrician." Elias nodded immediately, already pulling his phone from his pocket. Michael, however, stepped forward with a light laugh. "It's just a little warm, isn't it? Kids get fevers all the time. No need to panic." The casual dismissal landed wrong, sharp against Naomi's focus on the child. She looked up at him, her voice steady but edged. "No one here is panicking. We're taking care of her." Something in her tone seemed to surprise him, perhaps the fact that she didn't temper her words for his comfort. Elias glanced between them, then said, "Michael, why don't you give us a minute?" It wasn't a suggestion. Michael held his brother's gaze for a beat, then shrugged and stepped back into the hall. The night stretched into a vigil. The pediatrician reached by phone, gave instructions for care, and asked them to monitor her closely. Elias stayed in the nursery with Naomi, his jacket tossed over the back of the chair, his sleeves rolled. Every so often he would reach over to feel Amara's forehead, the crease between his brows deepening. At one point, Naomi caught him watching her instead, as if trying to reconcile the sight of her with the version of events that had existed before she came into their lives. She said nothing, focusing instead on keeping Amara comfortable, the child's fitful breathing slowly evening out against her. By dawn, the fever had broken. Amara slept more soundly, her lashes still damp from the earlier hours. Naomi eased her into the crib, covering her gently, and then sat back in the rocking chair, exhaustion washing over her in slow waves. Elias remained by the window, the early light tracing the edge of his profile. "You stayed all night," he said quietly. Naomi didn't open her eyes. "So did you?" The moment hung between them, not heavy, but certain, a recognition that in the crucible of that night something had solidified. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of a mutual understanding that went beyond roles or paychecks. Later that morning, Carmen from social services returned for an unannounced follow-up. She walked through the nursery, noting the calm atmosphere, the way Amara reached for Naomi with sleepy affection. When she turned to Elias, there was no question in her voice, only a statement. "This household feels more stable than when I was last here." He nodded, glancing briefly toward Naomi before replying, "We're learning what works." Michael left that afternoon without fanfare, his departure marked only by the low purr of the sports car disappearing down the drive. The house felt quieter in his absence, as if it had exhaled. Naomi returned to her work, but there was an unspoken shift in the air, the kind that comes when a household endures a test and finds itself, unexpectedly, a little stronger than before. The choice spring had arrived in earnest by the time the conversation happened, the kind of spring that carried the smell of rain before dawn and stretched long evenings into gold-tinted hours. The gardens outside the Ward estate were coming alive, in slow bursts of color, and even the house seemed to loosen in the change of season. Naomi noticed it most in the nursery, the way sunlight spilled through the tall windows in the late afternoon, the way Amara's laughter seemed to linger in the air long after she'd toddled from one end of the room to the other. Life here, once brittle and cold, had grown into something warmer, something that made Naomi pause in quiet moments and wonder when she had stopped counting the days until she might leave. One morning, after breakfast, Elias found her in the nursery, crouched beside Amara as the child tried to fit mismatched puzzle pieces together. "She's getting better at that," he said, leaning against the doorway. Naomi didn't look up. "She doesn't give up. That's the difference." Elias stepped inside, his expression serious in a way she couldn't quite read. "Can we talk?" She rose slowly, brushing her palms over her skirt. "Of course." He gestured toward the hall, leading her to the study. The room was as she'd come to know it, papers spread in careful disarray, the faint scent of cedar from the shelves, sunlight streaking across the desk. But today there was something different. In the center of the desk sat a folder, its edges neatly aligned, as though whatever it held was not to be handled carelessly. Elias remained standing, his hands resting lightly on the back of his chair. "I've been thinking about everything," he began. "About the way you've been here for Amara, for me, for this house. About what's changed since the day you walked in." Naomi felt her pulse quicken, though she kept her face still, and he tapped the folder once. "I want you to stay, not as staff, not as someone temporary. I want you to be part of this family. I've already spoken to my attorney. If anything happens to me, I want you named as Amara's legal guardian." He paused, watching her reaction carefully. "And as for now, I want you to take on a formal role in the community project. Full salary, your own team, the authority, to shape it into what we've been talking about. You've already been doing the work. I just want you to do it without limits." For a long moment, Naomi said nothing. She moved closer to the desk, her fingers brushing the folder but not opening. That's a lot you're putting in front of me." "I know," Elias said quietly, "and I know what it means to ask. But I also know I'm not offering this because I think you owe me something. I'm offering it because you've earned it. And because Amara doesn't just trust you, she needs you." Naomi's throat tightened, the weight of the offer pressing down from every angle. "You can't say things like that unless you understand what they mean," she said finally. "If I agree to this, it's not just when it's easy. It's when she's sick and you're out of town. It's when the company is in chaos and the house is a mess. It's when you wake up one day and decide you're not sure anymore. If I stay for all of it." Elias didn't hesitate. "Then stay for all of it." They stood there in the filtered light, neither moving until Naomi finally sat in the chair opposite him. She opened the folder, scanning the first page. The legal language outlining guardianship, her name woven into sentences she never imagined would hold it. She closed it again, the sound soft but certain. "I'll stay," she said, and though the words were simple, they felt like they reshaped the air between them. That night, after the rest of the house had gone quiet, Naomi stepped into the nursery to check on Amara before bed. The child stirred at the sound of the door, her small arms reaching up instinctively. Naomi lifted her from the crib, the warmth of that tiny body settling against her like something that had always belonged there. She eased into the rocking chair, humming low as Amara's breathing slowed. She didn't hear Elias enter, but when she looked up, he was there, leaning against the doorframe, watching them with a look that was softer than she had ever seen. "I was going to cover you with a blanket," he said quietly, "but I think you're exactly where you're meant to be." Naomi glanced down at the sleeping child, then back at him. "We both are?" And for the first time since she had set foot in this house, she didn't feel like she was passing through someone else's world. She felt rooted, steady, exactly as she had told him, ready for all of it, whatever it might bring. The choice had been made, not for the job, not for the salary. For Amara, for the home they had built together, one quiet, steadfast day at a time.